first thing I saw when I opened my front door was a white SUV floating sideways through my neighbor's yard, headlights still on beneath the brown water. 30 feet beyond it, the brand new road our homeowners association had built across the marsh was splitting down the middle like a wet cracker. And standing on the roof of the house she nearly destroyed was Morgan Vale, the HOA president who had spent 6 months telling everyone I was afraid of progress. My name is Ethan Cole, and I have lived at the edge of Briarwood Hills for almost 20 years, long enough to know which trees lean first in a hard wind, where the foxes crossed after dark, and exactly how much rain the old marsh can take before it starts talking back. Most folks in the neighborhood called it the lowland, which was a polite way of saying nobody wanted to walk through it unless they had boots on. To me, it was home. My father bought the property when I was a kid, back when Briarwood Hills was still cow pasture and gravel roads, and he taught me something I never forgot. He would tap the ground with the toe of his boot and say, "You do not own land the way you own a truck, son. You borrow it, and it keeps receipts." I thought that sounded dramatic when I was 12. By the time I was 54, I understood exactly what he meant. The marsh behind my house was not pretty in the way people mean when they say pretty. It did not have flower beds, or fountains, or little stone signs with inspirational quotes. It had cattails, cypress knees, black water, mosquitoes, big enough to pay rent, and more frogs than any reasonable person should have to listen to after midnight. But it also held water when the storms rolled in, and in southern Georgia, that mattered more than people like to admit. For years, Briarwood Hills treated the marsh like the weird old uncle at Thanksgiving, a little embarrassing, slightly inconvenient, but useful enough when things got bad. Then Morgan Vale became HOA president. Morgan had moved in from Atlanta with perfect hair, a silver SUV, and the kind of smile that made you feel like she was already calculating how much your kitchen renovation would add to the neighborhood comps. She had worked in luxury real estate, which she mentioned often, sometimes when nobody had asked. At her first board meeting, she brought a projector, a stack of glossy renderings, and what she called a vision for the future. Her vision was a paved shortcut from the north entrance to the county highway, a clean little connector road that would supposedly reduce traffic, raise property values, and make Briarwood Hills look more modern. The problem was, the clean little connector road ran straight through my land, not near it, not beside it, through it. I waited until after the meeting, caught her by the coffee table and said, "Morgan, that land is protected wetland. You could not pave it without permits, surveys, environmental review, and a stack of paperwork thick enough to break a folding chair." She gave me that calm little smile of hers and said, "Ethan, it is basically a muddy field." I looked at her for a second, then said, "A hospital is basically a building too, but I would not recommend pouring concrete through the middle of one." She laughed like I had made a charming joke, and that was when I first realized she had not heard a word I said. A week later, the HOA sent me a violation notice for excessive vegetation. I stood in my kitchen holding that letter while frogs croaked outside my window, and I remember thinking, well, this should be interesting. I wish I could tell you that letter was just Morgan being petty, that I laughed, tossed it in a drawer, and went back to my coffee. But that is not what happened. I read it twice, then 3 times, because the wording was so ridiculous, I thought maybe I had missed the joke. Excessive vegetation, standing water, failure to maintain community standards. They were describing a wetland like it was an untrimmed hedge outside a townhouse. I called the HOA office the next morning and got Denise, the board secretary, a sweet woman who used to bring banana bread to the neighborhood potlucks before Morgan got her claws into the place. I said, "Denise, can you explain to me how I am supposed to mow a federally mapped wetland without getting arrested by somebody with a badge and a clipboard?" There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Ethan, I am just reading what the board sent over. Morgan says the land is creating a visual issue." "A visual issue," I said. "Denise, it is a marsh. That is like saying the moon is creating a nighttime issue." She let out a nervous little laugh, then lowered her voice. "You did not hear this from me, but Morgan is serious about that road. She thinks if she gets enough violations on you, people will stop listening when you object." That was the first honest thing anyone had said to me in weeks. From that point on, the notices started arriving every few days. $100 for unmanaged vegetation, $250 for stagnant water, $500 for obstructing a proposed community improvement. That last one almost impressed me. They were fining me for interfering with a project that did not legally exist. I sent the board a package with my property deed, wetland maps, county survey records, old drainage plans, and a letter from the State Environmental Office confirming the land was protected. I even highlighted the parts they needed because I was trying to be helpful and because somewhere deep down I still believed facts had weight. Morgan sent back a 2-sentence reply. The HOA believes the proposed access route falls within a community easement corridor. I read it while sitting on my porch with a beer in my hand, and I laughed so hard I nearly choked. There was no easement. Not a disputed easement. Not a confusing easement. Not an old, forgotten easement buried in a dusty filing cabinet. Nothing. My grandfather had bought that parcel in 1978, and I had every survey from then until now. But Morgan had learned something dangerous about people. If you say something confidently enough in a meeting room, most folks will assume somebody checked it first. A few days later, she called a special HOA meeting at the clubhouse. She advertised free barbecue, which should have told me everything I needed to know. Nothing good has ever started with free barbecue and a projector screen. The room was packed when I walked in. Retirees in folding chairs, young couples standing along the back wall, kids running around with paper plates, everybody staring at a giant rendering of a smooth black road cutting through my marsh like it had been placed there by God himself. Morgan stood beneath it in a pale blue blazer, smiling like she was about to announce a new hospital wing. She talked about emergency access, safer commutes, rising home values, and the future of Briarwood Hills. Then she brought up her husband Grant, who owned a small paving company and had generously offered to handle construction at a reduced rate. That was when I stood up. I said, "Morgan, could you show everyone the permit you received to build across protected land you do not own?" Her smile barely moved. "Ethan," she said, "we are still finalizing documentation." "That is a fancy way of saying you have none," I told her. A few people shifted in their seats. I pulled out my folder and held up the maps. "This is private property. This area stores stormwater. It protects the houses down the hill. If you fill it, you are not building a shortcut. You are building a wall against every gallon of rain that comes through here." Morgan folded her hands in front of her. "You are always talking about rain, Ethan. We are trying to solve a real problem." I looked around the room and said, "Floodwater is a real problem. It just has the bad habit of showing up after people stop paying attention." Grant stood near the back with his arms crossed, trying to look important in a polo shirt, with his company logo stitched over the pocket. He said, "We have built roads all over this county." I looked at him and said, "Great. Have you ever built one through a functioning wetland?" He did not answer. Morgan stepped in before the silence got too embarrassing. She said, "This is not about one man holding the community hostage over a patch of mud." That line landed exactly the way she wanted it to. I could feel the room leaning away from me. Suddenly, I was not Ethan, the guy who had fixed half the neighborhood's generators after storms and helped old Mrs. Nutter Pruitt carry groceries when her knees went bad. I was the stubborn man with too much land, standing in the way of convenience. The board voted that night to approve what they called preliminary site work. I knew the vote meant nothing legally, but it gave Morgan what she wanted, a crowd of people who could later say they had supported her. On my way out, she caught up with me near the door. She said, "You should really consider being part of the solution." I looked at her and said, "Morgan, when somebody breaks into your house and starts moving furniture around, do you call that a solution too?" Her smile faded for half a second. Then she said, "You are making this personal." I said, "You mailed me a bill for having grass grow on my own property. You made it personal first." The next morning, my neighbor Ray knocked on my door before sunrise. Ray was 72, retired from the power company, and had the kind of face that always looked like he had just been told the price of something. He pointed toward the marsh and said, "You better get your boots on." We walked down to the tree line, and there they were, bright orange survey stakes pushed into the mud, running straight through the center of my land. 2 trucks sat near the road, and 3 men in reflective vests were pulling out old boundary markers. I asked one of them who told him to do that. He shrugged and said, "We are with Vale Construction. We were told the easement has been updated." I said, "By who?" He looked at the clipboard, then at me, and suddenly he did not want to make eye contact anymore. Ray leaned toward me and muttered, "Looks like they are trying to draw a road with a crayon and call it law." I wanted to laugh, but my stomach had already gone cold at law. I wanted to laugh, but my stomach had already gone cold. That afternoon, I called an old friend of mine named Claire Donnelly, an environmental attorney who had spent most of her career making developers regret cutting corners. She listened without interrupting, then said, "Ethan, do not argue with them anymore. Document everything. Photos, video, license plates, timestamps, GPS points. If they move one shovelful of dirt, I want proof before they can pretend it never happened." So that is what I did. I set trail cameras along the property line, checked my old survey markers, photographed every stake, and started keeping a notebook on the kitchen table. The first entry was simple. Morgan Vale has stopped asking. That means she thinks she has already won. What I did not know then was that she had not just moved some orange stakes. She had started a chain of events that was going to pull half of Briarwood Hills underwater. I thought she had already won. What I did not know then was that she had not just moved some orange stakes. She had started a chain of events that was going to pull half of Briarwood Hills underwater. The real work began 2 weeks later, before anyone from the county had even answered my complaint. I woke up to the sound of diesel engines chewing through the morning fog, and when I ran down to the marsh, Grant's crew had already pushed a bulldozer through the old tree line. Morgan was standing there in a white hard hat, holding a clipboard like she was opening a shopping center, instead of tearing apart somebody else's land. I yelled, "Get those machines off my property." She turned around slowly and said, "Ethan, we are performing approved preliminary grading." I walked straight up to her and held out my hand. "Show me the approval." She handed me a document with the HOA logo on top, 3 spelling mistakes in the first paragraph, and her own signature at the bottom. No county seal, no state permit, no environmental clearance, nothing. I looked at her and said, "This is not a permit. This is a flyer with an ego problem." Grant stepped closer and told me not to interfere with an active work site. I said, "Grant, you are standing in a protected wetland without a legal permit, so maybe we are both having a strange morning." I called the sheriff, but when Deputy Lawson arrived, he stared at the paperwork, stared at my deed, and did what people do when they are afraid of getting involved. He called it a civil matter. Morgan smiled at me like she had just won a prize. By sunset, the first section of marsh had been buried under gravel. The little drainage channel that carried storm water away from the neighborhood was blocked, the cypress roots were torn open, and the water had nowhere left to go. I spent the next month documenting everything while Morgan celebrated. She posted pictures of the new road in the HOA group, talked about modern access and neighborhood pride, and even held a barbecue beside the unfinished pavement. I went, mostly because I wanted witnesses. Morgan raised a plastic cup toward me and said, "Well, Ethan, looks like progress finally happened." I looked past her at the asphalt cutting through the wet ground and said, "No, Morgan, that is not progress. That is a dam wearing a road costume." She laughed, but it was not as easy as before. The rain started 3 days later. At first it was light, the kind of steady rain people barely notice. But I noticed because I had water gauges all along the property. By midnight, the level had risen 8 inches. By dawn, it had climbed over a foot. The new road was holding the water back exactly the way I warned it would. The culverts Grant installed were too high, too narrow, and completely useless. Water does not care about HOA meetings, community votes, or glossy brochures. It follows gravity. I called Claire, and she told me to warn the county emergency office. I called the county, and they said inspectors would come when conditions allowed. Then the big storm hit. It came in after dark, with wind that bent trees sideways and rain so heavy it sounded like gravel being dumped on the roof. From my porch, I watched the marsh become a lake. On one side of the road, brown water kept rising. On the other side, Briarwood Hills sat lower, quiet and brightly lit, like nobody understood what was waiting behind that strip of asphalt. At around 10:30, the power went out. 20 minutes later, I heard the road groan. It was a deep sound, low and ugly, like something underground had finally decided it had carried enough. Then the pavement split. Water blasted through the crack, ripped the road apart, and came down the hill in one violent war. Cars started floating. Fences snapped loose. I saw Morgan's silver SUV spin sideways through a yard and disappear into the dark. Then I saw her, trapped on the roof of her house, screaming into the storm. For 1 second I just stood there. I thought about every letter, every fine, every time she had called my land useless. Then I grabbed my rope, tied one end around the chimney, and went into the water. I got her across in 2 trips, half dragging her, half fighting the current, while her house came apart ice. When she finally collapsed on my porch, shaking and covered in mud, she whispered, "I did not know it would do this." I looked at the flooded neighborhood, at the road she built breaking apart in the dark, and said, "That is the problem, Morgan. You never knew what you were touching." By morning, the whole truth was impossible to hide. Engineers confirmed the road had blocked the natural drainage path. Investigators found forged easement records, false construction documents, and proof that Morgan had ignored every warning. The HOA collapsed under lawsuits. Grant lost his contract as license. Morgan was banned from serving on any community board, and the road was torn out piece by piece. A year later, the marsh was alive again. The frogs came back first, then the herons, then the soft green reeds pushing through the mud where Morgan had once posed for pictures. People still asked me whether I felt sorry for her. Honestly, I do not know. She lost her reputation, her home, and everything she thought gave her power. But 30 families lost something too, and some of them had trusted her, because trusting the loudest person in the room is easier than listening to the quiet one with evidence. So tell me this. Was Morgan just reckless, or should she have been held responsible for every home that flooded after she built that road? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because I still think about it every time the rain starts. And if you want more stories where power runs headfirst into consequences, subscribe and stay with us.